Good afternoon. My name is Marty West. I serve as Academic Dean here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's Askwith Forum. The Askwith Education Forum is our premier event series at HGSE. It's an opportunity for our community to come together to discuss the most pressing challenges and opportunities facing the field of education. In some cases, it also provides a chance to model how engaging in civil disagreement on contested issues can promote deeper understanding. And that's exactly what we will try to do tonight as we take up Ballot Question 2, a proposal that would change the requirements for high school graduation here in Massachusetts. Since 2003, Massachusetts students have been required to pass standardized tests in math, reading, and science, or to file a successful appeal in order to receive a diploma. A yes vote on Ballot Question 2 on November 5th would eliminate this requirement so that students would only need to meet their local district standards in order to graduate. Students would continue to take the MCAS test as required under federal law, but the results would no longer factor into graduation outcomes. We have an outstanding panel lined up to share their views on this question and ultimately to help those of us in the audience with an opportunity to cast a ballot over the next 2 weeks to make an informed decision. And I'll introduce those panelists in just a few moments. First, though, we have an opportunity to hear some additional background on the issue from John Papay. John is an associate professor of education and director of the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. He's also, I'm proud to say, an alum of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Over the past several years, John and his colleagues at Annenberg have been engaged in a research practice partnership with the Massachusetts Departments of Elementary and Secondary and Higher Education. Their work analyzes how students progress through the state's education system and into the workforce, with a specific focus on providing data to improve policy and practice in the Commonwealth. And recently, they issued a report that aims to ground the debate over Question 2 in evidence by pulling together key findings from that work. Importantly, John and his co-authors don't take a position on how voters should weigh in on Question 2. Indeed, as I understand it, those co-authors don't all share the same views. What they attempt to do instead is to provide a set of relevant facts that voters may want to bear in mind as they make their choices. The late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once quipped that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. I'm grateful to John for his willingness to help us attend to that distinction by sharing the highlights of his recent report. So please join me in welcoming John Papay to the stage to get us started.
Thanks very much, Marty, for inviting me here today. It's really an honor and to be back here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, in part because this project and this whole enterprise started 15 years ago in a doctoral seminar with Dick Murnane and John Willett right across Appian Way. And it's been a real privilege to continue to work with Dick and with John on this project over the years, as well as with many Ed School alumni and current students. Ann Mantle, Priyam Becchiani have been collaborators on this work. Lilian helped create the first data sets that we used here. And some recent Harvard graduates, James Lopresti, Ian Ferguson, have been part of our team, along with a bunch of other terrific folks who did not come through Harvard. Emma Zorfis, Kate Donahue, Aubrey McDonough, and Alan Perez. So all of which to say, this has been a real team collaborative effort here. Not just on our team, but with our partners at DESE and DHE. Really, we began the project, sort of a deeper dive on this analysis about 6 years ago when Kerry Conaway reached out and asked us if we would do some analysis to look at the MCAS as the state was considering new policies here. And so we are really, really grateful to the terrific collaborators at DESE and at DHE for enabling this work and for the partnership that's ensued over the last several years. So I first wanted to ground us in a very brief history of the competency determination policy, what the sort of state policy around what students need to do in order to graduate from high school. And so in 1993, as I imagine many folks in the room know, the Massachusetts Education Reform Law passed. I know Paul and many others in the room were instrumental in this. That law did many different things, including increasing funding for public schools, articulating content standards, or setting the expectation that content standards would be articulated, and requiring that students in the class of 2003 and beyond must pass tests in mathematics and English language arts in order to graduate from high school. And in 2010, added the law had anticipated this, but for the class of 2010, there was a new requirement put in place by the board requiring that students pass a test in science. There were some changes during the pandemic, and so for a couple of years, the policy was waived for a few classes. And in 2020, for the class of 2026, the board raised the passing standards on the MCAS test. And so students take tests in math and English language arts in grade 10, and now in biology or introductory physics in either grade 9 or 10. And they need to score a minimum score on this in order to satisfy the testing requirement of the competency determination standard, and if they need to satisfy a higher score or can do what's called an educational proficiency plan in order to meet that other standard. The main tests are administered in the spring, and there are retest opportunities in November and March in math and ELA, and in February in science. And also, it's important to note that districts can offer a Spanish bilingual version in math and, as of more recently, in science. So we've been looking at this, again, for this policy and sort of the attendant tests and the relationship between tests and long-term outcomes in the state for about 15 years now. And I think nationally there's really mounting evidence that we need high standards for all students, and that almost all students with appropriate supports and appropriate investments can meet those standards. Lowering academic expectations for students exacerbates inequality. However, there are clear disagreements in the policy space about the best ways to ensure that educators raise expectations and how to provide those requisite supports. And there are open questions about how well the test-based competency determination policy in Massachusetts accomplishes that goal. So in our recent report, we tried to provide a descriptive analysis of some of the key themes that were coming out, key findings that were coming out as we looked at the MCAS over the years. In the report, we highlight 6 findings. I wanted to put all 6 findings up here, and Dick and others on my team said, you can't talk about all 6 of these things. Let's focus on 3 big things. And so I want to make 3 main points today. 1, MCAS scores and high school grades have historically both predicted long-term outcomes for students. By long-term outcomes, we mean post-secondary success. We also track students in the labor market and measure labor market earnings. But in the past decade, grades have risen while test scores have fallen. And so this provides an interesting contrast. So the analyses we're going to show you rely on historical data. We need to think about what's happening currently as well. Most students pass, and by pass again, I mean they meet this threshold, this minimum passing threshold, testing threshold on the MCAS. But we're going to, technically, folks from DESE will not like me using the word pass here, but if I keep saying satisfy the testing, the MCAS testing requirement, we'll be here all night, so I'm going to say pass. Most students pass that standard on their first attempt, but those who barely pass do not appear to be college and career ready. And then third, while most students who initially fail do go on to either pass on retest or to appeal, and there's an appeals process I'll talk about in a little bit, about 85% of those who never pass are English learners or students with disabilities. All right, so let's dig into these. One question that people have asked us as we've been thinking about this are grades, course grades, or MCAS scores better predictors of long-term outcomes for students? And I think here we have a both-and story. We find that both MCAS scores and grades predict long-term outcomes. We find that MCAS scores predict long-term outcomes above and beyond other markers of academic success and other markers of student advantage. What we find here is, what we show is we compare students who have the same high school grades, and we plot by different levels of MCAS score, we plot their educational attainments. And so what we see is that for students who are scoring up here around the 90th percentile on the MCAS math test in 2012 to 2014, about 76% went on to graduate from a four-year college among students who had average grades in the state. Among students who had the same high school grades, we see that students who are scoring around the 10th percentile on the MCAS, about 16% of them go on to graduate from a four-year college. So MCAS scores predict these long-term outcomes above and beyond course grades. Even among students who have the same course grades, students who have higher MCAS scores go on to do better. But we find the same thing is true for grades, right? If we look at students who have the same MCAS scores, the average student who earns an A, 60% of them go on to graduate from a four-year college. The average student who earns a D in their 10th grade math class, 23% of them go on to graduate from a four-year college. And so we see this pattern sort of across different levels of educational attainment. We see it across different outcomes. So their MCAS grades and MCAS scores are telling us complementary but different things about students' performance. Both predict these long-term outcomes. Now, I will note that these patterns come from the legacy MCAS, not the next-gen MCAS, and they come from grades about a decade ago, not currently. So what's been going on here with grades and MCAS scores? Well, since 2003, MCAS scores in the state, 10th grade MCAS scores, have gone up substantially. And we see that by 2019, on the legacy MCAS, about 80% of students were proficient or scoring proficient or advanced in their 10th grade MCAS. Then the state introduced these new next generation MCAS scores, and the share of students who meet or exceeds expectations is substantially lower. And we see pandemic era declines in test scores that it's not shown here, but recent reporting suggests that these have continued. Now, we also compare these to the National Student Progress on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Now, they don't give the NAEP test in 10th grade, so we look at 8th graders, and we sort of track them, or not track them, but we sort of transpose the scores 2 years later. And we see that in the early years, there was increases in Massachusetts in NAEP scores that kind of flattened out, even though the MCAS scores were continuing to increase. But we see, again, these pandemic-era declines. That's very different than what we see happening with course grades. So we can only measure course grades starting sort of in the middle here, 2010, 2011. And this is what we plot here is the share of students who earn an A or B average in their 10th grade math course. And so we see grades increasing, and particularly recently, as test scores have fallen substantially during the pandemic, grades have continued, have risen here. And in fact, where there was a big blip right during the pandemic, but if we sort of extrapolate that trend line out, we see that grades are on an upward trajectory here. The share of students who are earning an A in their 10th grade math class has nearly doubled but over the past decade. And so big increases in grades over the last decade. And so I think these patterns raise important questions about the messages that students are getting and the signals students are getting about their educational proficiency and about their potential success for college and career. All right, so now let's look at students who are taking this test and not passing the test on the first try. So here we look at test takers in 2016. We see about 50% of them fail that test. Of those students, about 60% end up going on to graduate from a Massachusetts public high school. Of those 4,730 students, about 92% of them go on to retake the test. So nearly all students retest. Of those that retest, about a third of them, or a little more than a third, pass on their first retest. Although about a third of students fail, but then eventually go on to pass. And about 24% of those students who initially failed never pass on retest. Now, the state has a policy for what students can do if they retake the test repeatedly and don't pass it. Students can appeal. And we see that about 6% of students appeal successfully, about 1% appeal and are not successful, and about 17% of students who failed never appeal. All right, so most appeals are successful, but relatively few students who retake the test and fail, relatively few students appeal. And I want to zoom in on these appeals, literally, I guess, as well as figuratively, because There's important differences here across districts. Districts file appeals for students, right? Students can't appeal on their own. The district has to file appeals, and there are several different types of appeals. But the most common is that the district can compare students' grades for students who took the same course to students who passed the test, and if students who failed had similar grades to students who had the same course-taking histories, they are able to satisfy the competency determination in that way. So when we look at across the state, 21 districts had at least 10 students who never passed on retests, so took multiple retests and never passed. In 7 of these, the district filed appeals for more than half of students. And remember, almost all appeals that are filed are granted. But in 8 districts, appeals were filed for less than 10% of students, and there were no appeals in 4 of these districts. And so there seems like there's important variation across districts in how the districts are accessing this appeals process. And that has important implications for the policy if it moves forward. All right, so let's dig into these, the sort of relationship between course taking and MCAS scores. Again, we find that nearly all students who are succeeding in grade level content pass their first MCAS test. So here we show the passing rates for students who are enrolled in a geometry class or higher in 10th grade. We see that students who are earning an A or a B, nearly all of them are passing on their first test. And about 70% of students who are failing that geometry test end up going on to pass. But if we look at students who are enrolled in 10th grade in Algebra 1 or lower, right, there's geometry content on the 10th grade MCAS, and so these are students who are not yet taking some of the content that is on the test. We see the passing rates are not surprisingly much lower. About 12% of students in the state are falling in this category of taking Algebra 1 or lower. They represent about half of students who are not passing the test. But you'll also see here that about 50% of students who are failing their algebra class in 10th grade, their Algebra 1 class in 10th grade, so they're not taking a class that covers the MCAS content, and they're failing that class, about 50% of those students are still going on to pass the test on their first attempt. All right, so let's talk now about these students who repeatedly take the test, but do not pass the test. They satisfy their local requirements for graduation, but they never earn their diploma. About 85% of these students are English learners or students with disabilities. So about 85% of the students who retake the test, who make it to 10th grade, who satisfy all their local graduation requirements and never end up earning a diploma are English learners or students with disabilities. Our team has done a lot of work, led by Ann Mantle, on immigrant newcomers in Massachusetts high school, students who arrive as English learners in high school, and about 24% of these students who fall in this category are high school immigrant newcomers. They represent just 4% of test takers in these years, but 24% of students who make it to their senior year, or who satisfy all their local graduation requirements, but don't earn their diploma. And about half of these students are low-income Black or Hispanic students. All right. 2 more points I want to make here. So you'll notice that I said it was going to be 3, but then I spread them out across different slides. And so students who are scoring at the passing cutoff have low outcomes and do not earn a living wage by age 30 on average. And so what we see here is we look at students who took the test, and here we have to go way back to students who took the test in 2006 to 2008. And there, the minimum passing standard was around the 9th percentile. That's what it's been in recent years in mathematics, although I think in this current year, with the decline in MCAS testing, it's more about the 12th percentile. We see on this pattern, what we plot is the median earnings at age 30 for these students. And so we see that students who have higher MCAS scores, that blue line in the middle, I cannot reach that, but the blue line in the middle continues to go up. And so students who are scoring higher on their MCAS on average have higher earnings. There's obviously a distribution of earnings around that median, and so here we show the 75th and the 25th percentile of earnings at each level. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is this dotted gray line here. We see these students who are scoring at the passing cutoff. They go on at age 30. On average, these students are not earning a living wage in Massachusetts, suggesting that they are not college and career ready. I'll give you a few more statistics here about this. We look at immigrant newcomers who took the access test to measure their English language proficiency in the same year as they took the MCAS. Immigrant newcomers, we look at the students who just passed on the ELA test, and here we're using the new cutoff of 470 on the test, so the higher standard. They had an average access literacy level in the same year, or around the same time, of 3.4. That's below the criterion to exit EL services in the state on the literacy component. Only about 30% of students, and here we're looking at these students who are scoring, who are just passing, scoring right close to the cutoff. Only about 30% of them go on to take the SAT. Of those that do, less than 1% of those students reach SAT college and career readiness benchmarks in mathematics. Among the relatively few students who enrolled in college math courses, who go on to college and enroll in a college math course, only 14% of them earned credit in that course. The rest failed their first college math course or were in a non-credit-bearing remedial or developmental course. Less than 10% of these students graduate from a four-year college. And so I think there's important questions here, regardless of how the ballot initiative comes out, about what are we doing with students who are scoring, who are here graduating from Massachusetts public schools, who are scoring at this level, but not going on to be college and career ready by these metrics. All right, the last thing that I want to say is we've also looked at schools and how schools are doing in terms of improving student outcomes. We did this work looking at schools that are increasing economic opportunity for students, as well as schools that are increasing test scores for students. And we focus here on schools that serve large shares of students living in poverty. And we focus only on low-income students in those schools. Each dot here represents a school. The further to the right you go, those are schools that are having a bigger impact, a bigger estimated impact on students' MCAS scores. The further up you go, those are schools that are increasing students' earnings at age 30 more than other schools. And so I want to draw a couple sort of lessons from this. One is that there is a positive correlation here. On average, schools that are improving students' test scores more are also improving students' earnings more. Second, there are a group of schools here that are improving earnings, but not improving test scores more. Now, some of these are CTE schools, and there's an important question about what schools are, how schools are engaging in this work and the different goals that schools might have. But there are some schools that are improving test scores, that are improving earnings without improving test scores. But I think I want to draw sort of attention to the bottom quadrant here, which are these schools that are improving test scores without improving longer-term outcomes. And I think that, again, regardless of how the ballot initiative plays out, we know that MCAS scores will be part of the landscape here, and I think we need to think about how are schools working to improve the sort of knowledge capacities and skills of students across the board. And we see, on average, that schools that do that better are raising earnings more. So I'll leave you again with these sort of three main points. MCAS scores and high school grades have historically predicted both these long-term outcomes, but in the past decade, grades have risen while test scores have fallen. Most students pass, in other words, they meet that testing standard on their first attempt. Those who don't pass do not appear to be college and career ready. Even those who just pass do not appear to be college and career ready. And then finally, while most students who initially fail do go on to pass on retest or appeal, about 85% of those who never pass are English learners or students with disabilities. Thanks very much. I'm excited for the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, John, for sharing your research with us. As our panelists take their seats, let me say that we're excited for you all in the audience to be part of our conversation as well. Some of you may already have index cards, and we have volunteers who will be handing out more index cards as our discussion proceeds. If you have a question, we ask that you write it on one of those index cards, ideally large enough for me to read it without my newly necessary reading glasses, and we'll be collecting them and asking as many as our time allows. Let me now introduce our panelists. On my far left is Max Page, president of the 117,000-member Massachusetts Teachers Association. Max is on leave from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he's been a professor of architecture since 2001 to serve in his current role. He and his organization led the push to get Question 2 on the ballot this election season and are now, of course, leading efforts to advocate for its passage. Next to Max is Mary Burke, executive director of the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents. Mary is a longtime education leader in the Commonwealth, having served as superintendent and deputy superintendent of the Chelsea Public Schools, as well as a principal, assistant principal, and teacher in the district. And then finally, in the middle, we have Pat Tutwiler as Massachusetts Secretary of Education. Pat directs the Executive Office of Education, which oversees early education, K-12, and higher education in the Commonwealth, and serves as Governor Maura Healey's top education advisor. Before being sworn in as secretary, Pat served, among other roles, as superintendent of the Lynn Public Schools and as a principal in Boston. So thanks to each of you for joining us. I believe that we are going to post language from the official ballot prepared by the Attorney General to remind us of the precise question facing voters. This is from the ballot that are laying on many of your kitchen tables, waiting to be filled out after this event. And in particular, I wanted to remind us of the slightly confusing fact that a yes vote would eliminate the requirement. So with that said, let's start with you, Max. As MTA president, your job is obviously to advance the goal of your organization's members, most of them classroom teachers in Massachusetts schools. What did you hear from teachers that led you not just to make changing the state's graduation policy a priority, but to go through the expense and effort to put the issue before voters this November?
Great, thanks, Marty. And it's really good to be here, part of this conversation. So I just wanted to start. I'll try to be brief. I know we're trying to have a real good back and forth. So very briefly, though, I want to be clear. My members are your public school educators. They're almost in every single district in the state. American Federation of Teachers represents Boston and Lynn and Lawrence and other places, but we represent the vast majority of the educators in our public schools. These are your public school educators that are beloved. They are also the experts on public education. So I really want to make that clear. It's my great honor to spend every single day going around the state, supporting members, hearing from them about their concerns. So that's point one. And the second point is that we are a democratic union. We're the largest union in New England. We operate democratically. When we talk about voting as democracy, unions are democratic, or at least the good unions are, which means the members told us over years and years, through the annual meeting, 1,500 delegates, through our board of directors, this is a crucial issue. This high-stakes test is undermining what we do as professionals, is hurting our neediest students. It's bad for our schools. So it bubbles up that way very clearly. And so we've been hearing it for 2 decades, really. Third point is simply that we acted this way, that is through the ballot process, which is another vehicle of our democratic process, because very simply, it's a descriptive statement as well as a value judgment, the legislature failed to act over many, many years. We have gone the normal route, the route that the legislature likes, which is filing bills, going to hearings, advocating for them. I took my daughter, who's now a senior in college, when she was, well, I guess she was 14, even younger than that, 12, to testify before Alice Peiche's committee about the need to have a moratorium, to have a commission on reforming this system. We went back every 2 years, as you're supposed to do, right? And finally, our members said, enough, let's use this other vehicle because we know the public is with us. So we gathered 130,000 signatures, more than any ballot in recent memory, because this is so popular with the public, and I'm now bringing it to the people. And that's what's going on, and that's what we are absolutely committed to.
Great. We'll come back to hear a little bit more of the specific concerns, but Pat, I want to come to you next. Governor Healey's administration has worked closely with Max and the MTA on several issues, yet you've parted ways on this one. You were recently quoted as saying you're adamantly opposed to Question 2, that you view it as a threat to the Commonwealth status as the nation's education leader. Why have you and Governor Healy taken that position?
Well, first thing I want to say is thank you. When I walked in the room, I was relieved to see a set of chairs and not a boxing ring. And so for those of you who came to see that, you're going to be disappointed. And I need to say at the outset, while there is a clear difference in an opinion and beliefs as it relates to this ballot question, Max and I have been partners on several initiatives and will continue to be as we go forward. But we are adamantly opposed to this ballot question for a few reasons. First, we come at it from a perspective of embracing that Massachusetts has long been lauded for having the best public schools in the country and even some international recognition for the public school education here. We got to this place not through serendipity or happenstance, but through a few really important things. First and foremost, as Max stated in his opening remarks, the teachers here are incredible. I know this, having worked in public schools here for almost 25 years. My children have gone through public schools here in Massachusetts. That's a really big piece of this. There's also been really thoughtful and intentional moves from the legislature to appropriately fund public education in Massachusetts, which is a piece of the puzzle. The other piece is accountability and assessment. All of those factors together have delivered us to being a prominent force in this country in terms of public education. And we think that this ballot question really seeks to take a pretty big bite out of a system that has worked pretty well. If I can continue, I know we got to be brief, but I'm probably not going to be. We believe also very deeply in a uniform expectation for graduation in Massachusetts. It shouldn't matter whether you're a student in Wayland, where I used to be principal, in Boston, where I used to be principal, or in Lynn, where I used to be superintendent. We should have the expectation that all of those students have met a minimum baseline before they graduate, right? And the MCAS is the only thing that guarantees that right now. If it's not that, it should be some other uniform standard. The ballot question does not offer an alternative. It just deconstructs what we have right now, which leaves us open to lots of different definitions of what the minimum standard should be for graduation. And the last thing that I'll say, and I promise this will be not that short. So a long time ago, I remember reading in a graduate class that change in education is a process, not an event. I think that was Michael Fullen who said that. So when you engage in a change initiative in education, there needs to be a thoughtful process. You need to identify and articulate exactly how student outcomes and preparedness will be better or improved as a result. And then you need to sort of be thoughtful about turn all the stones before you put that change in place. When it's an event, there are, in some cases, unintended consequences. And I would say with this particular ballot question, there are predictable consequences, particularly when we think about, as you just presented, what about people that look like me, who are poor, who have a disability, who are multilingual learners? What then, after this question passes, will be the impetus to get those students to a mastery of standards? What will be the impetus? How will we even know that they have? And that for us is worrisome.
Great, thank you. Pat, let me bring Mary into the conversation. Now, your organization, the executive committee of the organization, the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents, recently voted to oppose question 2 formally, yet you wrote a letter to state education leaders explaining your decision. And in that letter, you all assert unequivocally that the grade 10 MCAS exams alone are insufficient as the statewide standard for high school graduation. If that's the case, what led you to oppose question 2?
So I'm going to take the same amount of time that the two
That sounds good.
male leaders on my left and right took, even though we all were receiving the message prior to coming in here that we need to be brief. So that's not going to happen.
We're doing fine so far.
Okay.
It's okay.
Yes. So I lead the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents, 351 districts in the state, in the Commonwealth. We did not come to the decision of opposing question 2 lightly. There was a great deal of deliberation, great deal of conversation, and we surveyed our members. And so looking at all of this information, it was clear our members were telling us that we have to keep it in place. We have to keep the high school requirement, the grade 10 MCAS exam, in place, and then look and come together for something better. This is part of our core value. Since 1993, our association has been part of these discussions. Ed reform, we were part of that grand bargain, which said, yes, put the curriculum standards in place. That's the input. But you need to be measuring the output. Did our students learn? Are they prepared? Are they college and career ready? And so that's the assessment. That's the grade 10 assessment. Is it sufficient? No. We need to take a look at it. We need to do better. And I will say one of my biggest concerns as the former educator in the Chelsea Public Schools, the poorest district in the state, until SOA, thank you, Alice, and others. But absolutely, our district, 86% of our students are first language, not English. In Chelsea, 40% were limited English proficient. And yet, the high school exam inspired our students to work harder, to study harder, to achieve. And when they passed, even if it was the second or the third time, or in an appeals process, they felt good about their achievements. We have to be really concerned of the messaging that we're giving our students if we remove the MCAS exam. Are we having misplaced compassion for our most marginalized students?
Max, both Pat and Mary in different ways have sort of suggested that one of their concerns about question 2 is repealing the current requirement without replacing it with a viable alternative. Is that an accurate description of the ballot question in your mind? And if so, is that a problem?
So first, let's get clear what's going on here. The MCAS will remain. The ballot initiative removes the use of the MCAS as a graduation requirement. And it already, even in our good discussion here, it's been muddied. The MCAS will be offered next spring, and you will have the data available. And we have actually, as MTA, agreed, believe it or not, with some of the Rennie Center recommendations about how to improve that, given that it will still be here. So that's point one. We are replacing, and that's point 2, is we are replacing it. It says right in the ballot, that's actually not accurate. It says instead, districts will have to certify that students have met the requirements of our state standards, our state curriculum frameworks. And I think this is really important because this is one of the most stunning things in this campaign, is the confusion about assessment versus standard. The MCAS is not a standard. The MCAS is an assessment. You could say it's a great assessment, it's a poor assessment. We find that it actually covers a very small portion of our standards. We have the highest state standards in the nation. That's widely sensed. It covers every academic discipline, every grade through 12th grade. It's not just a 10th grade test. It's really a crucial part of this, and I urge you to go on the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's website and look through those curriculum frameworks, and they apply to every single district. They are the uniform state standards, and they are incredibly high. They structure report cards, teacher evaluation, DESE district evaluations, textbooks that publishers make. They are the core, and they are absolutely essential. That is crucial, what happened in 1993. Before 1993, we did not have uniform state standards. So the achievement of 1993, the Education Reform Act, which came about because of the lawsuit by my union and other organizations, was to create a commitment to a lot more money, when we know money matters in public education more than anything else. Secondly, save for the wealth of the family and their education. And second is having high state standards. So we achieve that. If anyone just says, like, you say it out loud, it's the MCAS and the graduation requirement that's led to great Massachusetts schools, you'll just laugh out loud at that, right? So I think it's a ludicrous idea. And yet, with this, when this passes, and it will pass on November 5th, we will still have that data. I just went to my public high school where I was the first student school committee representative on it. They did half an hour of discussion about the MCAS scores, and took the data, skeptical, finding some insight in it, and then promptly voted 7-2 to endorse question 2. because they recognize you have the data, it gives us a good overall, maybe it's a diagnostic, gives a good overall sense of some trends. It should not be used for the high-stakes decision about a student's whether they got a diploma or not.
If I may just respectfully push back on the idea that we will still have that assessment. I've got a 14-year-old at home who in recent weeks said, hey, Dad, on this whole MCAS ballot question thing, if I could vote, I'd be voting yes, because I don't want to have to care about this test. That is true. Right, and as a person who spent 15 years working in Massachusetts public high schools, I can tell you that there's going to be a significant shift in the outcomes of that data if the requirement goes away, and that's just a reality. The other thing that I would say, if you don't believe my perspective on it, is look what happened back in the early 2000s before it was a requirement. You had about half of the students passing it. When it became a requirement, immediately, overnight, the next year, you had close to 90% passing it. Why? Because it mattered. That's how students, high school students operate. That's how they think. If it doesn't count, I don't necessarily have to take this seriously. I'll just sort of go through the motions, which is a big deal as we think about what we use that assessment for. It's our only statewide window into how students with disabilities are doing. How do we know how each one of our students in each subgroup are performing relative to these standards, the Massachusetts learning standards in high school? We won't have that anymore if students aren't taking the assessment seriously. And so that is a supreme concern for us. And I would say anybody who thinks that we're going to continue to see the same kind of outcomes on the MCAS in a passed ballot scenario, come talk to me later. That's not going to happen. That's not how high school students think and operate.
Mary, I want to ask you to respond to something that Max said in describing sort of what would happen if question 2 were passed, this idea that local districts would be in charge of certifying competence in the state standards. He suggests this could be a more ambitious exercise than sort of just looking at their performance on the MCAS. Sort of, you represent local decision makers in education. I could imagine that being appealing to some of them, right? Them being the ultimate arbiters, yet your organization sort of doesn't want to be in that position. What are the concerns?
What we're looking for is to be able to identify the high school standard, the high school requirement or requirements that would say universally across the Commonwealth that an education in Chelsea is the same as an education in Wayland or someplace else. And so, what you're asking is a step backwards. You're asking for us to go back to, we've been there, we've done that. 351 districts, 351 different sets of variables of, requirements for a high school diploma. But then move it down another layer. It also means that individual educators are going to be able to put their own perspective, their own bias. Unless we have something that centralizes, what do we stand upon as, yes, this is a high school diploma, these are the minimum foundational skills, knowledge, and competencies that we're expecting. There are far more, and we can certainly do a better job of wrapping around our 1% of students who are struggling to attain that high school competency. We can certainly come to the table and have these conversations. It's an MCAS and not an elimination, and certainly with if this passes, eliminating the MCAS at grade 10 and nothing behind it. And how many years is it going to take, and the money and the hours to put something into place? Are we willing to let the next 4 years of high school graduates go through without a high standard?
So can I just
Sure.
want to follow up on one point. As I said earlier, nothing on this has happened. Other states, like New York, recently had a blue ribbon commission and came to the end of that they wanted to get rid of a requirement that the single way to pass required that test. Why has that not happened here? And I don't want to cast shade, but the reason our members acted is that the legislature and the past governors, this governor and the past governor, have not even been willing to have a real commission to look at this. So what we have done by gathering 130,000 signatures, putting this on the ballot, and when we win, it opens up a conversation about good things. Frankly, I'm not going to reveal all the things we talked about, but in good conversations with Rep. Peisch and the secretary, we had very thoughtful conversations about different approaches. It only happened because we forced the conversation by gathering these signatures for the ballot initiative. So once we win, then we start talking about things that Mary and I are very much aligned around. MCIEA, the Mass Consortium of Innovation and Education Assessment. Ideas of performance-based assessments that could be used across districts or even across the state that can be really understood and really measured very carefully, but they are real learning in real classrooms. MassCore, people have talked about this. 83% of students use the MassCore course of study, 4 years of English, 4 years of math, etc. Not a curriculum, but a course of study. Maybe we should talk about, shouldn't everyone have access to that? If a low-income district cannot afford to have world language educators, but we need that as part of this course of study, maybe we support that. So we are going to win this, and then we will open up a conversation. Well, great. Now that we don't want to have to focus on the MCAS, but focus on our state standards, what's the best way to bring that to every single area?
I know Pat is chomping at the bit. Then I want to get John back in the conversation.
You know what? Let John go first.
No, you go, please.
I know we haven't left it.
Just a couple of quick things. One, I mean, I appreciate what Max is saying, and I think he knows that there actually is some commonality in what could be a graduation scenario in Massachusetts, but we lift up the New York example, and for New Yorkers in the room, you'll know that there's been a Blue Ribbon Commission that has been working for almost 2 years now, maybe a little bit longer than that, to sort of dismantle or take another look at the regent's diploma versus the local diploma. But that's a process over 2 years where they've had a thoughtful and intentional initiative where they've turned stones and really thought about what are our core values, what do we want every graduate who comes out of a public New York State public school, what do we want them to know and be able to do? The ballot question doesn't present us with that opportunity. It is an event, and it puts us at a place where we don't have anything, and now we have to start the conversation. I would also name that the last time that a topic like this was on the ballot was in 2002. Some of you might remember this, the UNS initiative, where there was a proposal to ban bilingual education in Massachusetts. Guess what? It passed. It passed. And what did that mean the next year? And I was a teacher at the time. What did that mean for students for whom English is not their first language or multilingual learners? That next year, it spelled bad experiences. They were not served well. And it took the legislature 17 years to come back in 15 years, in 2017, to pass the Learning Opportunities for Our Kids Act, or LOOKT Act, which sort of overturned something that happened a long time ago. I don't want to see Massachusetts go to a space where we have nothing, and then we begin to think about every student meeting a certain standard. Too much at risk. I have a student in high school right now. I have an expectation that he be serviced well now with the system, and if it passes, he will not have that.
So let me bring John back into the conversation now.
Sorry,
and
John.
talk a little bit about the data.
I had my time.
Yeah, so John, you showed us a lot of evidence about the relationship between students' 10th grade MCAS scores and their long-term outcomes, their post-secondary success, their earnings. And I suspect there are some who would see that and argue that that must reflect sort of the fact that more advantaged students tend to score higher on the MCAS in the first place. And of course, they go on to sort of experience better long-run outcomes. But I heard you trying to say something a little stronger than that, which is that you think sort of the knowledge and skills that are measured by the MCAS are really directly influencing student success. Can you sort of tell us what makes you think that and how confident you are in it?
Yeah, I mean, Marty, I think as you well know, right? Like it's clear that students who have economic advantage, whose parents went to college, go on to do better in the labor market, and that's many of that is reproducing that social inequality. But I think that we've tried to dig into this using the data that we have, and I'll talk about a couple different things that we do. One is we look at students who are demographically similar on the things that we can measure, which doesn't capture everything, who attend the same high school. So that we know that there's residential segregation in the state. That does mean that high school students attend is meaningful. That have the same grades in those same courses in high school. And we find that even if we compare students who are similar in all these ways, students who, and who end up going and having the same ultimate educational attainments. So if we compare four-year college graduates who attended the same high school, who took the same course in 10th grade, who had the same grades, those who had higher MCAS scores go on to do better in the labor market than those who don't. And so I think that's one piece of evidence. The second thing we did is we said, well, let's look at students in 8th grade, compare students' scores in 8th grade and 10th grade. And so if we think that, and we know that that economic advantage of families affects students' scores, that would show up in part in 8th grade as well. And so we look at students who improve more between 8th and 10th grade, and we show that students who improve more between 8th and 10th grade do end up going on to earn more in the labor market. And I guess the third thing I'll say is I showed you those figures where we looked at schools that improve test scores more. Those also are schools where students go on, are schools that improve students' earnings more. Those are schools, again, those are all students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch in schools that serve large shares of students that qualify for free and reduced price lunch. And we look in these early years when we have survey data from students, and so we can observe in those early years their parents' educational attainments. So we're comparing students who have whose parents have similar educational attainments. Even with that, we find that attending schools where students' test scores go up more, those are schools where students' earnings increase more.
So Max, there are a lot of people who hear the type of evidence that John was just describing and say, well, if that's the case, we need to do everything we can to put pressure on schools and educators in them to ensure that students acquire these skills that the test is measuring. And I'm curious how you sort of think about that argument, sort of where your interpretation starts to differ. It could be that you don't accept the arguments about causation that John is trying to put forward. It could be that you don't accept the ultimate sort of measure that earnings sort of would be a good indicator of what we should be striving to do in schools, or it could be something else. So help us understand how you think about that.
So a little of both. I mean, I just want to offer one quote. I think this is from this report, John, or maybe it's from another where you said the MCAS test scores, that MCAS test scores predict long-term outcomes for students is expected, given the positive correlation between these scores and measures of family advantage. I guess the only thing I would edit, since I'm always editing, positive correlation, it's a very tight correlation, I think. I think it's very interesting, the nuance of the research. But folks, we haven't really said this openly here, and this makes people uncomfortable. And frankly, it makes educators uncomfortable as well. How powerful is the family disadvantage or advantage outside the schools impact what they're able to do in schools? Now, we want to say that every school, I believe every student has the innate ability to achieve what they want, and everyone is equal in that way. But our young people come in with such unequal conditions, and we have to acknowledge that we have the best public education system in the country. We also are one of the richest states. We also have one of the greatest gaps between the rich and the poor. So part of the argument about pushing the MCAS back to being a diagnostic test and not the all-seeing eye and the fundamental judgment of how our schools work is it allows us, that's a mirage to getting at some of the fundamental inequalities. One of the things I'm proudest about in the MTA, yes, we fight for our educators' rights and pay inside schools. We also fight for paid family medical leave for every worker in the Commonwealth. We've won sick leave for every worker. We've helped raise the minimum wage from 7, whatever it was, up to 11, and then 15. We're proposing $20 minimum wage. We won the Fair Share Amendment, which is providing more funds for free community college. We hope free higher ed completely. for a lot more money for our public schools in all kinds of ways. Universal school meals for every kid in every single school. Now, I don't introduce a little tension in the room, but let's just be clear who's on the no side. It includes groups. Most of them are funded by the Walton Foundation. These are the people who were wanting to privatize our public schools through charter schools, who fought against the Fair Share Amendment, which is providing $2 billion for public schools and colleges and transportation. So I don't want to, it's just important to understand the company we keep and which side you choose and why it would be that these same groups are so fundamentally opposed what the educators want when they have been working against the funding of our public education and frankly working against some of the things that might ameliorate the inequality that is so central to the inequalities we see in our public schools.
Pat, I feel like we're in one of those moments in the presidential debate where your name got mentioned and you need to respond. I don't know.
I didn't hear my name.
Opponents, people, those on the other side.
Well, first,
I don't think he's Walton funded.
No, I was going to say, let's make that clear. I'm not part of that situation. Here's what I want to say. There's one thing there's many things from your presentation that resonated with me, but one thing that I want to point out in particular, and I think it was in your first finding, that dealt with grade inflation, right? Which frankly, until I read this report this summer, I wasn't really aware of. But I understand that as your report lifts up, it's a phenomenon in Massachusetts. The GPAs have sort of soared, and performance on standardized tests has not. And I want to name, since that report has come out, that this is actually a national phenomenon. I think that this is yet another reason to, if you're thinking that it's a good idea to eliminate the MCAS as a graduation requirement, pay attention to that first finding. There's a mismatch between performance on standardized tests and GPAs. I think we need both, right? We need both to sort of look at and balance out, but it just sort of fuels, again, another worry that we have about moving to a space where there's no uniform standard articulated for graduation. I also want to say one other thing. I'm sorry, Mary.
That's okay.
Mary and I go back.
You're forgiven.
Thank you. She's still my mentee. Mentor, not mentee. Now I forgot what I was going to say.
I do that all the time. Sorry.
All right, so I'm going to jump in.
I got it. Yeah, it just came back. I apologize. I appreciate, Max, what you said earlier about you've been asking. Well, we're here now, the Healy Driscoll administration, and I think you know, and I feel it's important to share with all of you, we are deeply interested in rethinking the graduation scenario in Massachusetts. One of the first initiatives out of my office was reimagining high school, and this is coming from a high school person through and through. I know there's some others here, some former colleagues of mine in the room. We need to take a close look at the experience of high school because the data is telling us something. They want something different and better. And the high school graduation piece can absolutely be a piece of that conversation. We started a conversation with the MTA several months ago. I think, again, there's a lot of sameness in our perception around things that could and should be true related to the high school graduation scenario. But I think the elimination of the MCAS graduation requirement puts us in a really unfortunate position as a start point for that conversation.
Mary.
So I just want to go back to the comment you made about the mirage and that MCAS as a diagnostic is a mirage. I think it is a diagnostic. It also, over the years, has turned on the light to our students. And it has turned on the light for our educators to be able to wrap around our students more. At the same time, it has turned on the light for our families. Our families have more confidence in our education system in Massachusetts because they have not only certainly the high school test, but they have other grades. The high school test, however, is the high stakes. That's the one that the students pay attention to, that they work harder for. And so it's also, too, it's the general public confidence. And I dare say that when I was superintendent in Chelsea, one of the things that always happened was that when our high school students were applying out of state, the fact that they had a Massachusetts high school diploma, and that meant a lot to colleges and universities in other states. And so our reputation as number one, as being the best in the country, really helped to propel our Commonwealth students forward.
So I want to ask one more question of John, and then I have a large stack of index cards from the audience that I'm going to try and get to. John, I think a lot of people might initially go to your report hoping to learn answers to two questions. First, did the introduction of the MCAS graduation requirement lead students to learn more than they would have otherwise? And secondly, did the introduction of the requirement lead fewer students to graduate than would have been the case otherwise? But you all don't. You offer a lot of useful information, but you don't offer clear answers to those basic questions. Why are they so hard to answer? And what, if at all, can we say about them?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was intending to start my presentation with that. And again, wiser people on our team said, don't start by telling all the people, well, the things you can't answer, start with telling them the things that you can. So I think you're right. It's very hard to get to answer these things for a couple of reasons. One, and I think the most important reason is there are so many things that happened all around the same time here. So when the Ed Reform Act of '93 came in, there was increased funding, there were standards. Pat, you articulated this really clearly. It was a package of things, and I think that trying to disentangle the impact of any one of those things becomes really hard. And so thinking about, it's easier to think about what the impact is of the whole package, and I think we see pretty clear evidence that educational attainments went up, test scores went up, NAEP scores went up, all sorts of things improved in Massachusetts education system because of that package. We wrote a report talking about this. And, you know, again, there's huge equity gaps, but if we look within group, we see more substantial improvements in all these outcomes. So, but it's very hard to say that the MCAS testing standard was the result of this. We can do some things like look at what happened when the science exam was introduced for the class of 2010. But again, that was one small piece of a whole broader educational landscape. But we did see shifts. The science exam did shift things, like many more students are taking biology in 9th grade now because of the introduction of that exam. And so we do see responses to these policies playing out on the ground. But it's hard to say, and I think that, I guess the last thing I'll say here is, we hear this on both sides, right? Graduation rates went up here, even though the exams were in place. That means that the exit exam didn't prevent students from graduating. Well, again, so many things were happening. On the other hand, we see, a lot of students who fail the exam, many of them don't graduate from high school. Well, that's also, we don't know what their outcomes would have been had the whole policy not been in place. Maybe they were doing better, maybe they weren't. And many students who barely pass also don't graduate from high school.
Just one tiny data point I think is really important. This has been part of what we've discussed, and lots of people, educators and other researchers have discussed. And I think there's a really great study by the Citizens for Public Schools through the report, Lessons Learned. The fastest growth in MCAS scores happened in the years after 1993, but before the graduation requirement. They happened because we had new state standards and we had steady state investment. And now, I'm not going to say this is exactly related, but as funding kind of did not seem to continue going, there was ups and downs for a number of years, that's when you also saw the decline in the growth of MCAS scores. And I think that's really, not that I think MCAS scores are the best way to measure, I certainly don't. That's part of the discussion we're having, is that MCAS scores do not actually measure most of our state standards for our public schools. But that's a very important point, that they went up as we invested more and as we had state standards, not because there was a graduation requirement and a club hanging over kids' heads.
So let me turn to a couple of these questions from the audience. Hello, my name is Soleil. I hope I got that right. And I'm a sophomore in the college who graduated from a public high school in Fall River, Massachusetts. As someone who grew up as a high-achieving, low-income student who firsthand witnessed how students of my background were extremely unmotivated by the MCAS due to extensive preparation time that took away from interactive learning opportunities in the classroom. How would you respond to these concerns from us? And then I found another one that says, what about teaching to the test? I've spent 1,300 hours doing that. It's boring. So I think those are related. Pat and Mary, I'll ask you to respond to that. And Max, you haven't talked much about that as a concern, the potential implications for instruction. So, Pat.
So here's what I would say to that. As Max articulated earlier, Massachusetts has a robust set of learning standards, right? A very clear articulation of what students should know and be able to do in each core content area in each grade. The MCAS simply measures mastery of those core content skills and knowledge. This idea of teaching to the test, I would say, is true from the standpoint of what you're supposed to be learning in class is reflected on the assessment. The other thing that I would say is remember that the MCAS happens in grade 9 for science and in grade 10 for ELA and math. The overwhelming majority of students are done. I think each year about 84 or 5% are in their sophomore year done with all three. And then you have the rest of high school. Well, what about those other 2 years? I've seen incredible innovation in Massachusetts high schools over the past 25 years. A case in point, Massachusetts has computer science in about 84% of its high schools. The only states that have higher rates of computer science in their high schools are the ones that require it as a graduation requirement. States like Rhode Island, I think, went there recently, and a bunch of southeastern states. Those are the only ones above Massachusetts. It's not required here. It's an offering for students. We've seen early college blow up in Massachusetts, go from about 600 students when it started about 6 years ago to more than 10,000 this year. That, by the way, has been launched as an equity initiative in Massachusetts, targeting Black, Brown, low-income, and multilingual students. It is prominent in those districts. Lynn, second largest early college.
Chelsea.
No, you weren't second, though.
I was
We've seen that grow in the Massachusetts space. 30% of the high schools in Massachusetts have an innovation career pathway, which really gets to attacking that boredom, right? Connecting the relevance of what's learned during the school day to a career or an industry that the student's interested. And so I would really, and especially when students say this, it's hard for me to respectfully push back on that, but I feel compelled to because that has been my experience in high schools over the past 25 years.
So I would echo what the Secretary mentioned, but I would also say that, yes, we do, as leaders, as district leaders, as principals, we also have to monitor what our teachers are doing in the classroom, and certainly encourage our teachers not to limit the teaching to a test. And certainly, we would encourage our parents and our community and our school committee to also encourage teachers to scale back when it's not necessary. But I do echo that if you're teaching standards, by default, you're teaching to the test, and we are teaching to the curriculum standards. That's what we're supposed to do. So, yes, I do think we also have to monitor, though.
Max?
So just a couple points, and actually, Soleil, wherever you are. Hi, good to see you. I was just in Fall River last night, actually. Educators there, 200 strong, are fighting for a strong contract for themselves and their students. Just first, a report. I mean, this is, as I said at the very beginning, what I do is I go around and I talk to our members and I engage with them. And then over and over, what they say is that the high-stakes test forces them to narrow the curriculum and teach the test and teach test-taking skills on a Chromebook that's a bubble form. It's just, in that way, I mean, I believe it because I trust them. I hear this over and over. I have a little game where I say, a random group, I'll just say, like, how much of time is spent in the test, in your spring taken over with either the test prep or the administration of the test or the extra time given to this kid or retakes? How much of the time does this disrupt? And it's 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 4 weeks. It's weeks of real learning. And I have to say, we all agree, I think everyone here, every ed reformer in the audience would still agree that an educator in a classroom with a student, an authentic learning, is the most important thing that happens in schools. I think we all agree on that. So why are we putting this pressure on that is forcing then superintendents and principals and then educators to spend so much time on things that are not authentic? And I'll just quote one of our educators, Justin Brown from Brookline. And he said that his students would say, like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? We want to do our other work that we've been doing, the projects we've been working on. And he would say, I don't really know, but we have to do it. And what he said, I thought it was beautiful and actually tragic. He said, it drives a wedge between me and my students. I've spent the whole year trying to build up the relationships with them, and the relationships are the key to learning between the educator and their students. And then they say, well, now we got to take all this time to focus on this other thing that is unrelated to what we have built up in this classroom, in this community. And that's tragic, and that's what I hear from our members.
John.
I guess I was wondering, I find this argument very compelling, but I also feel like, is there a way we can change the narrative around this teaching to the test? I think that our evidence shows that there are schools that teach the test, at least that was way too strong. There are schools that one reason they might be in that bottom quadrant there is that they are teaching to the test and building students' skills to take a test and not their knowledge, skills, and capacities that will pay off. But I also think we see examples across the country of schools that are teaching students to have, to engage in deeper learning, and those students all also demonstrate that knowledge on the test. So I'll give you two examples briefly from other states, nothing here in Massachusetts, but I was just at a conference about transforming the teacher profession in Chicago. And there was Christina was there as well, and there was the Utah Teacher of the Year was there from a couple of years ago. And he was talking about how he shifted his classroom from being a classroom where students were sort of accepting the content to generating content. And he, has them do videos and podcasts and all this. And we spent a long time in a little small group talking about how do we identify teacher leaders and are test scores useful there. And he was talking about this, how he generates deeper learning. And someone asked him, well, how did your students do on the test? And he said, something to the effect of course they did amazing on the test, right? Because they were engaging in this deeper learning, they thrived. I'll give you, my kids are in Providence Public Schools. My son was in 4th grade last year. The 4th grade team last year, Mrs. Zesk, Mrs. Mendonça, they took the students. This is a school that has a large share of students living in poverty. They took the 4th grade class basically every week on a field trip with no money. They took them on walking field trips across the city. They went to these places. They called places. They spent basically a day a week not doing instruction, taking the kids out. They did all the things of deeper learning that you would see. Students, they were differentiating instruction in both of their classrooms. You look at the RICAS results that just came out, they were both in the top quartile of student growth in the state. And so I think that there is this opportunity as we think about reshaping the narrative around teaching to the test to how do we sort of develop those practices whether or not there's a testing standard.
All right, if we use that as our model, we're not going to get through many questions. So
30 seconds just to say that you asked it because you were asking about this, about educators and how they feel about it. The reaction is that this negative reaction I've talked about is sending educators leaving the profession, and we've all seen, and this is a crisis that is upon us. I know there's a lot of future educators in the room, but the number of students who are choosing education as a major and wanting to become teachers is cratered, and that's a huge problem. And I will not say it's only because of MCAS, but I would say that we know this, that part of it is the sense that the professional respect for those teachers and their own creativity and professionalism is being questioned.
Well, that leads naturally to a question that's here for Pat. Max has said, it reads that teachers who are members of the MTA are overwhelmingly opposed to the way that standardized tests currently work. What is the state of Massachusetts going to do to respond to teacher concerns on this issue, regardless of whether this ballot initiative passes, or especially if it does not?
So that's a very good question, whoever asked that question. Well done. We've been thinking a lot about the scenario of a passed ballot measure, what's next. And while I'm not in a place to sort of articulate that publicly right now. Just know that that is very much top of mind for us. But I want to go back to what I said earlier. No matter what, we're going to need to engage a process. So there's not going to be, a pass ballot question in November, and then, in the fall of 2025, we've got a brand new, shiny graduation system. It's going to take some time. The states that have really sort of, dug deep and figured out what's the best graduation scenario for students in our state, it takes years. And then if there's some sort of, Max mentioned earlier, Mass Core, which I actually think there's something to Mass Core, which is right now a recommendation in Massachusetts, 4 years of English, 4 years of math, 3 years of lab science, 2 years of world language, art. There's a budget implication for districts, particularly in Western Mass, around getting to a place where they can actually offer that to students. And so these are all considerations that will take time, will take money, will take collaboration. And so at a high level, I will say we will be engaging around all of those things. But part of the concern is this is, in many ways, throwing the switch on a system that has been in place for a long time. And then we're going to need to scramble and engage a thoughtful process to think about what's next.
So the question asked either way, but it also said, especially if it does not. So if the test remains in place, is there an opportunity to address teachers' concerns, maybe to push practice in the direction that John was just describing it could go? What would that look like? And Mary, I see you wanted to get.
Well,
Marty, let me just throw something in right quick. That's what reimagining high school is all about. An initiative out of my office, it was one of the first ones that we announced. That's what that's all about, engaging that conversation. Go ahead, Mary. Sorry.
After you.
I think both Max and I won't let the Secretary of Education not address it one way or the other. So that's all I want to say.
Max.
And the only thing I would want to add, which was something that just hit the Boston Globe before we came in here, which is, I'll call it promises, threats by the leadership of the House and Senate that they would overturn this if it passes. And so if anyone's worried about democracies on the ballot nationally, you should worry about that here. If the will of the voters is to move this forward, they need to move it forward, because this is far more broadly voted on than things that happen in the legislature. So I was disturbed by that. You'll see the quote that I have in there. But I hope that that's not the step. If there's either way, there's obviously, as I said earlier, we've opened up a conversation by doing this ballot initiative, a kind of conversation that's long, long overdue. And I really just hope that both the governor and the Senate and the House would not just ignore the will of the people.
So that we're clear, that is not in my purview.
Max, I have another one for Max Page. You're arguing, it says, that teachers and superintendents know their students and can uphold standards without the MCAS. How would you ensure that students are actually achieving those standards?
How do
so are you've placed a lot of weight on the standards themselves as a, tool for ensuring access to the content.
Yeah. So the way the professional system works, our education system works with our professional educators, is that these standards are the fundamental basis of so much that goes on. I think I said that earlier, and I think it's worth just quickly reminding people. This is not just like a standards in a book and you push them aside. Many districts have report cards that are aligned to the standards. Every year, teachers are evaluated according to the standards that they taught and how well they did that. The textbooks, the curriculum, when publishers do that, they say, what are the state standards in Massachusetts? Or if they're in California or Colorado, they look at our standards and develop that. DESE comes in every few years to review the curriculum and the work of that school district. It's based on the state standards. And I know there was a lot of nuance there about the relationship of grades and of testing, but overall, I think John was saying, as we've seen before, that grades are a very good predictor of how kids will do overall. And so I don't know what to say. Our professional educators are so committed to this work, and they are committed to the very highest standards. I mean, that's the theme of our campaign: is high standards, not high stakes. So, and I just want to lift up one other thing, that this ballot initiative actually suggests something that does not exist, which is certification. Actual districts would have to certify that students have met those standards. Right now, that's not actually part of the law. So that actually lifts up our state standards, and again, all the way through 12th grade, which I think we care about.
All right. Or did you want to get in, Mary?
The standards, I think I've mentioned this before, the standards are the input. The outcome is the assessment of the student learning. All of us as educators have said, I taught it, but the question is, did they learn it? Are they ready for college and career at the point of the high school exit? And that's what we want to be able to say to our students, our families, and our public, that this is the confidence we have. You have definitely achieved not only the basis for skills, knowledge, and competencies as assessed by the MCAS exam, but then we've taken you even further as a district.
30 seconds only to say, why is it that some of the finest private schools and parochial schools in the country, right here in Massachusetts, don't require the MCAS? If it's such an important measure, those students graduate and then they get jobs and go into college.
They're students
and
of
people
privilege.
evaluate them and say, like, oh, we trust because we think the educators and the curriculum, et cetera, have proven that they're able.
Just quickly, they don't, because they all take an assessment before they get there.
Yes.
And they're very selective, and not all students are able to gain entry to those schools.
All right, let me get to
the
one more
parents are
question from the
invested.
audience, because it gets to an important aspect of this conversation that I don't think we've given quite enough attention to so far. The question asks, regardless of the initiative outcome, what is the concrete plan to support English learners and students with disabilities who do not meet benchmarks at such high rates? Pat, do you want to take that first?
So first, I just want to name that is the fundamental question, right? Each year you have about 700 students, as you, I think you said 1,000. My data says about 700 students who, of the 70,000 graduates, who meet all their local standards, but are unsuccessful on one or more of the MCAS assessments. So I think that's the fundamental question. I think this involves not only thinking about what the supports look like for those students, but then is the framework of the high school experience appropriate for each one of those students? I think about the multilingual learners that you presented, that we've been studying, looking closely at. The students who fail to be successful on one of the MCAS assessments, typically, if you're a multilingual learner student, have been here fewer than 5 years. And interestingly, ELA is not the barrier for those students. It's not the language difference. It's actually math that tends to be the most prominent barrier, which is offered, as we know, in Spanish. And so there's a content challenge there. So I think we really need to dig deep in partnership with the commissioner of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed to think about how are we helping these students master standards and dive in. But I want to be clear, eliminating the system for everybody is not the response that's appropriate.
Can I just tag on to Secretary?
Pat.
You know, absolutely. In Chelsea, that was one of the things that we looked at intensely. 40% of our students were new to the country, in the country less than 3 years. It was former Commissioner Mitchell Chester that I actually showed data to, that we were getting our 10th grade students, our EL students, to needs improvement, not proficient, the status level, the passing level. We were getting them to needs improvement within 2 to 3 years in the country. That's a phenomenal data point. And so we do have to look at the 700 and even beyond the access scores. We have to take a look at how do we wrap around and push their achievement even further. And in terms of the math was always the hardest to do because our immigrant students are coming from countries, for the most part in the urban areas, where the education system is not solid. And math is hierarchical. You lose one 4th grade or one 6th grade component or concept, it collapses when you get to the MCAS. So we do have to get better at diagnosing what's missing in that hierarchy.
John, you and your colleagues have been doing a lot of work. You mentioned it briefly on immigrant newcomers arriving in high school. What sort of insights can you offer based on that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can. The question I think gets right to the heart of it. What are we doing about this group of students? And I think one of the things that was striking to us as we looked at this across the state is how different the populations of students are in different districts. And so in some districts, right, they're all the newcomers who are arriving are speaking Spanish, and that provides different instructional challenges than in other districts where the language heterogeneity is enormous. And so how do you think about serving the needs of all students who are coming from different backgrounds with different educational experiences and different pathways into the country? And so I don't have an answer, but I think that's a critical question.
Max?
There was something I wanted to respond to about this, and now I've just played Pat Tutwell on this, forgetting this. I guess one thing I do want to add in, I want to say this. I feel like it's this part of the discussion as we get toward the close to remind everyone the MCAS will still be here. The question 2 replaces the high stakes element of MCAS. So the discussions about we can actually use MCAS data to begin to in whatever ways is valuable to address some of the issues we're talking about. And I said earlier that there are parts about the MCAS, what languages it's offered in, how many days it takes, maybe the turnaround time of the scores. Most of our educators find out the scores the next year, and they don't even get most of the questions. So what is it actually advancing in terms of pedagogy? So I think there's important, I just wanted to make that note. The other thing is to make sure we introduce or remember the class element. There are ELL, students with immigrant students with disabilities, and we also fundamentally know that there's a tracking between MCAS scores and family income. And actually, it's Pat's successor in Lynn, Yvonne Alvarez, the superintendent there, wrote a very powerful letter to DESE saying, I have a huge increase in poverty, but what I get back is your school is failing because your test scores went down. It's like, let's focus on the fact on what our students need. We have very needy students who've come from all over the place, all over Massachusetts and the world. That's what I need support on, not telling me that our students have failed because because poverty so closely tracks these scores. So I just want to make sure we include that here.
So we are just about at time, and I want to be respectful of people's time. I also know that there were a lot of people who came and shared that they were coming here to sort of get some insight on how to cast a vote over the next 2 weeks. And I'm sure we've already given them a lot. You all have given them a lot to think about. But I want to give each of you the opportunity in 30 seconds or less to leave us with your closing argument or the thought that you want to make sure that people walk away with from this conversation in order to make an informed vote. Max, we'll start with you.
Okay, so 30 seconds. So to do that, I'm simply going to list a few names. So I'll point to Kathy Greeley over there, great educator from Cambridge and an author of a book against the high-stakes testing. Justin Brown from Brookline, Kirsten Fraser from Education Association of Worcester, Marissa Freed, Marissa I think was here earlier, Michelle Irvin, Kelsey Romano. These are just a few of the names of the 117,000 members. These are the lifeblood of our public education system, and almost unanimously, and we have surveyed them and talked to them, they feel that it's long past time to get rid of the high-stakes element of the MCAS and get back to more authentic learning.
Mary.
That's about 30 seconds.
Very good.
I guess in 30 seconds, I would say we need to ask ourselves, what is the message that we're sending our students? Are we sending our students a message of, we believe in you, you can achieve this goal, and yes, it is high stakes, but in life, there are going to be a lot of times where it's high stakes. And are we not supposed to be making our students college and career ready? And that means giving them the experience of achieving high stakes. I think we have to be very, very careful that we are not placing misplaced compassion in front of a very smart decision. And I say that also knowing we have to fix it. We have to get better. We have to support the 1% for the 99%. And we have to have those conversations about what the new requirements or requirements will be.
Pat.
I just go back to the idea that in education, If you're going to engage a change initiative, it needs to be through a thoughtful process, not an event. When it happens as a result of an event, there are consequences. And I think I've sort of articulated or attempted to articulate exactly what those consequences will be if there is no MCAS as a graduation requirement. What will be the impetus for making sure that students that look like me, whose first language is not English, who are economically disadvantaged, who have a disability, what will be the impetus to ensure that that student is mastering standards, mastering skills and content? Think about that as you prepare to vote.
John, you started off the conversation. You get to bring us home.
All right. Well, I literally don't have a vote in this as a Rhode Island resident, and I've been not gonna share my specific thoughts on this. But I guess there are two pieces that I'll say here. One is I think that this question to me about what happens if the MCAS as a graduation requirement. If the MCAS is removed as a graduation requirement, what does it mean for districts to certify that? Because, stay tuned for new reports that will be coming out on our academic timeline of very, very long time. But we've been looking at grades, and right, the differences in students who have similar MCAS scores across grades are pretty astounding, and across districts are pretty astounding. And so there are these important differences in standards. What's that going to look like, and how do districts, are they going to certify? The second thing is, regardless, I've been really struck by the outcomes of these students who are passing the standard, but just passing the standard, and how poor those outcomes are for students. And so how, regardless of what happens, thinking about redesigning high schools or the full system, how to ensure better opportunities for all those students.
Well, about 90 minutes ago, I said that sometimes the Askwith Education Forum provides a chance to model how engaging in civil disagreement on contested issues can promote deeper understanding. And I think thanks to each of you, we've accomplished that goal. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Well done.